Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to our 6th BEREC Stakeholder Forum. Thank you very much for coming. I think at this point in time we are on the one hand side at a starting point. The code was just finalized, and today we will present our work program, not only for 2019, but it has also some impacts on 2020, so we are on the way of turning our yearly work program into a multi-annual work program, and given the tasks that we have to fulfill based upon the code, we are looking now more on a 18 to 24 months time period. And in this time period, it will be crucial to have a very, very close relationship and a close dialogue with you, our stakeholders. So, as I said, this is the starting point of a dialogue that is more important than ever. Then, given the outcome of the code, it is our task and our most important task to do to provide clarity and certainty based upon the new rules. We think that with this dialogue and the stakeholder engagement, we can take out of the code the best possible. There are some opinions that the code is a missed opportunity. The industry may say that they haven't achieved what they wanted from a new framework. There are some other voices that question the fact that there was a necessity for a new framework. So, but whatever it is, we have it now on the table and we have to cope with it. And I think the best way forward is to take it and make the best out of it in a close cooperation between stakeholders. So in that sense, we are at the starting point. On the other hand side, we as BEREC realized that we are already in the midst of transposition, and we are already working very hard on the transposition and to provide certainty and clarity upon the new rules. So we have started a very intense dialogue already with the EU Commission to find out about their thinking and their views on the transposition period. I just want to mention the rules on the termination rates, how to treat these in the coming 2 years when the code has to be transposed in national law. There are other topics, how to handle certain proceedings when some member states have transposed the codes, others will not have transposed the code. So there are a lot of procedural questions that we have to clarify in the near future. We have also just started our dialogue with RSPG. As you know, under the code, there is a new role and a new format called the peer review, and where BEREC has a role together with RSPG, and to kickstart the process of finding common ground for this review, for this peer review, we have just started to talk with RSPG. There is also a third aspect that concerns the work program of 2018. We have done a lot of pre-work anticipating what will be in the code. When we designed the work program for 2018, there was already the proposal of the Commission at the table, and so we started to draft projects where we can and where we wanted to anticipate the work that has to be done for in 2019 and 2020. So we have already issued reports on contractual simplification. We have done a report on the location of the network termination point, and this is all already groundwork for the code. And in particular, I want to mention that during my chairmanship, we have initiated a process called BEREC the Next Decade, where we wanted to step back a little bit and reflect on the mode of operation of BEREC. I'm totally convinced that BEREC has to change, BEREC has to develop, and the way we worked last year, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, will not be the same as we will in 1 year, 2 years, or 5 years. So we started this process. We had a first workshop during our last plenary. I personally see this stakeholder forum as one additional step. We are prepared to take your feedback. It might be a painful process for us, but we are happy to take feedback from you. So what I can say is I want to invite you and encourage you to give feedback to BEREC. We want to listen, and we want to get better, and we want to intensify the collaboration with all the stakeholders. So, having said that, once again, I want to invite you to contribute. Thank you very much again for all the requests that we had for participation. Not all, we were not able to invite all to the stage, so we wanted to establish a very interactive session, and I only can invite you to participate and bring forward your ideas, your comments, and your criticism. So once again, thank you very much for coming. I'm very much looking forward to a very constructive discussion this afternoon. And in particular, I would like to thank all the participants, all the speakers. I want to personally thank Philippe Defresne and Tony Schotel for being the moderators for this afternoon. I want to thank BEREC Office for the organization, and in particular Jeremy Godfrey and his team from ComReg to organize the stakeholder forum. Thank you very much, and have a nice afternoon. And now I'm handing over to Jeremy, but before, I think we will have a short video. Thank you.
Since its establishment almost 10 years ago, BEREC has driven greater levels of harmonization for the benefit of consumers and the single market in Europe. For example, BEREC contributed vital technical input during negotiations on the European Electronic Communications Code. In June 2018, the European Parliament and the Council reached agreement on the code. It sets the scene for the future of the European telecoms landscape and addresses the sector's future challenges. The new framework includes measures to stimulate investment in very high-capacity networks, mobile connectivity, and 5G. It covers new rules for OTTS, and it entrusts BEREC with the implementation of consistent regulatory measures as well as the protection of end users. As one example, BEREC will report on member states' best practices in defining the available adequate broadband internet access service, which all consumers can access at an affordable price. BEREC is committed to supporting the smooth deployment of 5G, responding to connectivity challenges, updating the net neutrality guidelines, and engaging with stakeholders. All of this is reflected in BEREC's Work Programme 2019. Participate in the consultation on the BEREC Work Programme 2019 now. Let your voice be heard.
Good afternoon, everybody, and let me also welcome you all. It's the responsibility usually of the incoming chair to prepare the work programme for the next year. Johannes told me that I would have a very easy task. All I would need to do was read the code, and that would tell me what we had to do. The problem was that the code kept changing. So we were trying to, it was a bit of a moving target. And if I've had one nightmare, I wake up in a cold sweat, it's that we discover that there's a provision in the code with some work for BEREC that nobody had noticed, and that we get into severe trouble. But fortunately, I think there's been a lot of good work by my team, by the regulatory framework team within BEREC. The Commission has helped us, stakeholders have helped us, so if we have left something out, I think it will be a collective failure. Let me really just talk about three things. One is some context, then really the themes of the work programme, and I'd like then to talk a little bit about how BEREC delivers, which I think if you work in BEREC, you kind of think that our arcane processes must be something that everybody knows about, but I think it's probably, we certainly had feedback from stakeholders that maybe that wasn't as well understood as it might be, so I'd like to just talk a little bit about that as well. So I think by way of background, I think the videos say it much better than this, the static slide. The industry is certainly changing. There's a couple of statistics there about changes in the recent past, but I would almost characterize it as saying we are on the cusp of, on fixed networks, what is really a once-in-a-lifetime change. The technological change from copper to fiber, from current generation networks to very high-capacity networks, really is something that happens very, very infrequently. It's many decades in between. And then on the mobile side, the technology changes happen maybe more often, but again, there's a very fundamental change coming from when we have the adoption of 5G. So it's a very good moment, really, with these profound changes to have a new code and to be focusing on implementation of that. So been a lot of talk about the code. I won't, there's many other conferences where you can hear about the details. We've gone from the 4 directives and the BEREC regulation to the single unified code and a new BEREC regulation. And within the code, there are changes in the way wholesale regulation works, changes to the spectrum management. OTTs have been brought into regulation where they are based on the use of telephone numbers. There's been useful updating of consumer rights. Universal service has been updated for the broadband age, and some changes to the way BEREC operates. And the code objectives are, the first 3 are objectives that we currently have in the framework. The last one about promoting connectivity is worth mentioning, that connectivity in very high capacity networks, it's a new objective. It ranks equally with the other objectives, and obviously many of the tools to promote connectivity will be the promotion of competition, the promotion of investment. Promoting the take-up of connectivity will involve providing information to end users, making sure that they can choose services with confidence, they can use services with confidence. But I think that having in our heads, and it's not just for BEREC, it's for the Commission, it's for member states, it's for NRAs, that we all have this objective of promoting the availability and take-up of connectivity on very high-speed networks. That, I think, will colour the way we approach the other issues. And there's one project in the work programme that is at least partially inspired by that new objective. So let me move on to the themes for the work programme. As Johannes said, first thing that I'll talk about is that we have longer-term planning on a 2-year time frame. The second thing is, Johannes wasn't joking when he said most of what was going to be in the code, most of what was going to be in the work programme would be derived from the code. There's been a lot of guidelines and opinions and that BEREC has been entrusted to make. But we didn't want BEREC just to be focused entirely on the operationalization and implementation of the code. We wanted BEREC to continue to play its role of examining longer-term issues, forward-looking issues, and raising the questions, beginning to answer them, convening the debate. And lastly, the collaboration with stakeholders, and Johannes already talked about RSPG, has been a good feature of BEREC's work and something that we want to, again, highlight for 2019 and beyond. So I talk about the longer term planning. I think the first reason why we wanted to plan over an 18 to 24 month time frame was that the sheer volume of work that we are called upon to do in supporting the implementation of the code couldn't be done. The resources that would be required just from the NRAs couldn't do it in 12 months. But of course, we don't need to do it in 12 months. Most of the delivery dates for the guidelines are aligned with the transposition dates of the code. So the code will be transposed and come into force after 2 years, and the guidelines, it's useful for them to be available in advance of that. But for most part, we're aiming to deliver the guidelines during 2020, but to start work on them and do much of the work on them in this year. Now, there are a couple of other advantages to planning over that longer time frame. One is that, as far as possible, we will not aim to finalise guidelines within the next plenary after issuing a consultation. We have a lot of feedback from stakeholders that it's very difficult for them to respond to BEREC consultations. They are often networked organisations themselves that have to gather input from their members, consolidate it, argue about it before they come back to us. So by planning over a 24-month time frame, we're able to give a longer period for people to respond. And of course, the burden on BEREC to do the guidelines implies a burden on stakeholders in giving us input on those guidelines and those other things. So not only does this reduce the burden on us or make it more manageable, it makes it more manageable for our stakeholders. And another thing that we want to do in our longer term planning is also give opportunities to stakeholders to give us their ideas at earlier stages in projects. It's already part of BEREC's current medium-term strategy to have more kind of two-stage consultations, to have call for inputs or to have workshops with stakeholders at an earlier stage while we're defining our ideas. And the last thing I'll say about a kind of innovation in the way BEREC works that will be different this year, and it's part of the BEREC the next decade programme, is to have earlier discussions amongst the heads, not so much about what a set of guidelines should have in them, but how ambitious, what degree of harmonisation should we aim for in those guidelines. So it's, in my time in BEREC, when we have difficult discussions, it's often towards the end of a project where people are actually disagreeing about whether we should be very prescriptive in guidelines or very permissive. And the discussions we'd like to have up front would be about things like, for example, at a conference I was at yesterday, a presenter from WIC talked about that we'd had a period of experimentation. So if there's an area that's completely new, that nobody really knows what the best way to implement is, that it would be useful to allow some experimentation, and in a few years' time we'll have some evidence about what a best practice is. That might argue for having less prescriptive guidelines at the early stage. If, on the other hand, it's an area where the costs to pan-European operators could be significantly reduced by making sure that something was done in the same way in every member state, that would be a reason to make the guidelines more prescriptive. So what we want to do is have a discussion both about the level of harmonisation we should be aiming for and also about the reasons why that's a sensible idea, so that the people who work on the guidelines can have some guidance for themselves about what benefits we're seeking to achieve. So we're not going to just deliver guidelines because we've been told to. We want to make sure that the benefit of having those guidelines is identified up front, and then that the work done on them delivers those benefits. So to talk about harmonising implementation, most of it's about the code, but there is other legislation too. There's the Open Internet regulation, the roaming regulation. So there are various guidelines we do around that. There are in fact 12 BEREC guidelines in the 2019 work programme. I've highlighted 4 of them here. The first one to highlight is the update to the guidelines on net neutrality. So in the course of this year we've been gathering input from stakeholders about how the net neutrality regulation and how the BEREC guidelines have been operating. We will give an opinion to the Commission as part of their evaluation of the regulation. It seems to be generally thought that it's pretty unlikely the Commission will want to embark on a review of the net neutrality net neutrality regulation. Next year's not going to be will not be a good time to initiate a new legislative proposal with a new Parliament and a Commission coming in towards the end of the year. So almost certainly we will be wanting to address the guidelines because a number of issues have been raised in the course of that process that make it seem sensible for us to clarify the existing guidelines. It's probably not going to be throwing them up in the air and starting again with a blank sheet of paper. We haven't had enough experience to want to do that. But there are pieces of input people have given where some clarification would be useful, might unlock investment, might reduce perceived regulatory risk. The second one to talk about is the guidelines related to intra-EU calls and SMS. So this was this I highlight because it'll be the first set of guidelines BEREC produces, and the reason it'll be the first is that this provision will come into force with direct effect next May, and we are called upon to have guidelines on the circumstances in which NRAs might grant a derogation to the obligation to price those calls at the euro rate. And so, of course, people will be applying for derogations in advance of May, and we need to have those guidelines. I was asked at the debrief when we launched this consultation whether we were planning to limit those guidelines to the very specific issue of derogations. And the answer I gave to that question was, frankly, that was what we had in mind when we proposed this project. But if stakeholders think that there are other aspects of that provision that might usefully be covered in guidelines, then the consultation on the work programme is exactly the right time to tell us that, so that if there's a desire that there should be 1 or 2 other issues slightly expanding the scope of the project, but not please changing it fundamentally, that would be something we can consider. And then the other 2 that are on the slide there are both about the implementation of the access, the new access provisions. These are really complicated. There's actually more than one set of guidelines about symmetric access and co-investment. There are issues about where is the network termination point, what is the first concentration point at which it might be regarded as not economically viable or technically viable to serve people. A lot of very technical issues that BEREC is very well suited to address. And actually that reminds me, I would say we look at this work, and during the course of the code there was discussion about should BEREC become an agency. And I think we're glad at the outcome, because what this results in is the hundreds of experts across the NRAs, several hundreds of experts collaborating together in expert working groups. We have the real regulatory practitioners doing that work, rather than an agency that might be more remote from the markets that are being regulated. And having asked for this task, we're glad we've been entrusted with it, but it is something that BEREC is now very committed to delivering. As well as guidelines, there are a number of opinions to the Commission. So the code has, some of the things in the code get implemented by the way of Commission implementing acts. And often the code says that the Commission must consult with BEREC before making the implementing act, and that means we will have to have opinions. So there's a couple there. Johannes already talked about the summary template for consumer contracts, where we've already been doing work on that area, so we'll be in good shape to formalize that into an opinion. Databases is a new departure for BEREC. We are I'll just highlight one of them there, which is a database on general authorizations. So BEREC is to have a database of all the authorized undertakings in all the member states. associated with that database is a template on the information to be provided. Given all this work, there hasn't been a lot of bandwidth for BEREC to do to do best practice reports on other areas. But we do think it's important that experience sharing should happen at an expert level. So as well as the formal reports, there'll be some expert level experience sharing workshops. So again, to highlight one, there'll be one on economic replicability tests on margin squeezes, which is something which more and more NRAs are using, and it was felt useful for there to be some sharing of experience. We may publish a very short summary of the issues discussed at the workshop, but that won't be a document that people are expected to take account of in doing their work. So it's more for the benefit of the experts. Looking at the forward-looking work, there's a few items there. On the left, we have a study on the dynamics of investment in connectivity. So this is the one I alluded to earlier, that is partially inspired by the connectivity objective. There's been quite a debate about the impact of regulation on investment, and that's going to be, in fact, one of the topics for the panel after the coffee break. But the debate that we've had in the last few years, and a few of us were at a conference earlier in this week, we've heard the same perspectives being articulated by the same stakeholders year after year, without really any kind of coming together or any kind of resolution of that. So on the one hand, you have people saying, regulation is very bad for investment. If we have to open up our networks, if we have to have open access, there won't be any investment. On the other hand, you have people saying, we don't want to return to monopoly, that will stifle demand. You have people saying that competition actually drives investment, that a big reason why people invest is the fear that if they don't, their competitor will, and will take away their market share. None of these perspectives is probably 100% right, and none of them is 100% wrong. What we'd like to do is use a technique that looks at the dynamics of the market, of how these different forces interact with one another, to try to produce a somewhat more complete picture of the dynamics. And one of the things we would also like to identify is whether there are circular feedback loops in those dynamics. So to take an example of what I mean by that, investment in fiber networks will depend, one of the things that will drive it is the extent to which there's a perception, what people think about demand. And demand for those networks will be driven by there being applications, things that people can do that they can only do on those fiber networks, they can't do on other networks. Who's going to develop those applications? Well, the people who develop those applications are going to be concerned about the size of the addressable market if they're going to invest in that innovation. And the size of the addressable market, of course, depends on the rollout of the networks. So there's a big circle there, which means that at the beginning, none of the actors may see very much advantage. But as things get going and you get to a tipping point, then all of a sudden every actor in that circle sees a lot of advantage in continuing to invest in their part of it. So if we can identify the feedback loops, we may find regulatory interventions or policy interventions that can accelerate the way those loops work, and that can have that may turn out to have a bigger effect on the pace of rollout than can be discovered through the sorts of debate we've been having recently. So that's a very interesting study. The first phase of it will be looking at it from a qualitative perspective to try and build up a picture of the dynamics, and if that's successful, we'll move on later in the year to try and quantify that for a number of maybe 2 or 3 exemplar markets to see if we can run some simulations and experiments. Second one to talk about is 5G. That's been a big theme for BEREC this year. We don't want to sort of rub our hands and say job done on 5G. This project is there to look at aspects of 5G that are not related to spectrum particularly. So there are two legs to it. One is, what is the impact of 5G on the way we regulate generally? And an example of that might be when we do access regulation, when we do market analysis of broadband markets, in what way should we take account of current and prospective substitution of fixed networks by 5G? The other leg is, what is the role of regulation in enabling the 5G and the IoT innovation ecosystem? So there can be issues like, are the current arrangements for roaming going to work for things, for vehicles or other connected devices that need to cross national boundaries? What's to be done with numbering? There was an issue that we discussed at our last plenary about coverage mapping. Would it be useful for innovators to have, in a consistent format, data about 5G coverage across Europe, so that when they're planning their investments, they're planning their rollout, they don't need to go to 28 different sources and look at 28 sets of data that are formatted in different ways and prepared on a different basis in order to work out what the addressable market might be. So these are the kind of issues. Now, this project is not intended to answer all those questions. It's actually intended to identify the questions, maybe identify some of the possible answers, and it will be in future years that we'll start working on maybe coming together to work out how those questions should be answered. Third one is really a short piece of work, which is about consumers. I think a lot of the debate you hear in the conferences in Brussels is about the impact of the code on the industry. We want to make sure that we don't forget what should the impact of the code, what should the impact of the digital single market be on consumers, and maybe have a vision or start to develop a vision for how end users and consumers should benefit from the digital single market. And this is inspired by a similar piece of work that was done in the energy sector, and this workshop will then feed into BEREC's next medium-term strategy, which we'll be working on in 2020. And then the last thing to talk about there is the report on the data economy, which is something that we've really been working on this year. It's out for consultation, but will be finalised in the beginning of next year. So let me talk a little bit about how BEREC delivers. We collaborate with the NRAs across the 28 member states and all the agencies. And they come together, each of them contributes expert resource to expert working groups. They collaborate remotely, increasingly through video conferencing. Sometimes they meet together in Brussels to come up with ideas about what we should do. Their report goes to a contact network, which gives it back to the working group for polishing, and then the final version will come to the Board of Regulators, which is the heads of all the agencies, who will endorse and release a document for publication. And that process, as I say, it involves the experts at working level coming up with ideas. It involves the heads of the international units, applying some quality control, resolving unresolved issues, and it involves the heads, where necessary, giving strategic direction and formal adoption. So that's a process which results in quality documents, quality guidelines that really do draw on the expertise of the practitioners. And to just give a specific example, put some names to it, in the contract summary template work we've been doing, over there on the left you see Tom Boyce from Comreg in Ireland and Bogdan from Romania, who are the co-chairs of that expert working group. They're the co-chairs of the end users expert working group. And in this project, they started off by sending out a questionnaire, finding out what is currently being done by all the different NRAs. What is our current practice? What's our current experience? they work together with a small subgroup of the expert working group, which we call a drafters group. So those will often come from NRAs with the greatest expertise in the area and the greatest interest in the area. And they will produce a first draft for review by the full expert working group. That gets reviewed by the full expert working group, it gets refined, the contact network, which is the heads of the international departments in all the agencies, then do their review, finally the BEREC members and observers. And after the approval, we will typically publish a document for public consultation, and then on receiving the responses, that process starts again of the expert working group and the drafters revising the version that went out for public consultation. And as I say, often, as well as this process, at the very first stage, we will try to engage with stakeholders, possibly in a call for inputs, possibly in workshops where that's relevant. Finally, let me talk about collaboration. So Johannes talked about the need to collaborate with the industry stakeholders. This is absolutely vital for us. The stakeholder forum is one place we do that. Workshops on individual projects may be another way we do it. And of course the formal responses to consultations and other informal engagements is part of it. Now in the next session we'd like to seek more views on how we can do that more effectively. In terms of other stakeholders, in the last few years BEREC has worked a lot with the European institutions. We think we've built up a relationship of trust with the Commission, with the Parliament, but also with other agencies, the RSPG, the Data Protection Network, and ENISA and so forth. We want to continue that. We think that's very important, that telecoms is really, it's only a corner of the digital ecosystem. Yeah, maybe it's more than a corner, it's a foundation of the digital ecosystem. But its importance isn't so much in telecoms itself, it's in what it enables. So we do need to engage with all those other actors so that we make sure that we're not regulating in a vacuum, and that there's a good two-way dialogue. The other aspect of collaboration I'd like to highlight is international collaboration. So we talk and exchange views with regulators from other parts of the world, with the FCC in the United States. We had a trip to Canada and we signed an MOU with the Canadian regulator this year. We've had similar exchanges with India. But what is very important already and will be very important over the next 2 years is supporting the Western Balkans initiative. So as part of the Commission's work with the Western Balkans nations to enable them to gradually get ready for accession, then working with the regulatory agencies in those states to assist them to understand EU regulation, to build the capacity to participate in eventually in BEREC, to start the capacity to apply EU rules. Although I have to say, in the last meeting we had with the Western Balkans regulators, we discovered that at least some of them had done more than some of the BEREC NRAs in certain types of market analysis and so forth. But I think that's a very important role for us, and we're very committed to assisting there. To help, please help us refine the BEREC Work Programme for 2019. Give us your feedback. As I say, that a lot of it is focused on the code, but if there are useful tweaks you think we could make to it, if there are useful small expansions of scope, if there's something you think is there that shouldn't be, if you think there's something that's totally missing, please let us know. Of course, this is in fact the second time we've asked for help on the work programme. Earlier in the spring, we had a lot of good input of ideas, some of which have made it into the work programme, many of which, because of the pressures, weren't able quite to be accommodated. But we're open for submissions till the 7th of November, and I look forward to hearing your feedback. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Introduce. Oh, I've gone. I'm going to introduce Philip Dufresne, who I think most people know from Cullen International, who's going to facilitate the rest of the session.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jeremy. Good afternoon, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, the next few minutes will be of great importance for the future of BEREC, and I'm requesting your undivided attention. And I'm asking you to please grab your phone or your tablet, whatever you're using. Close off whatever you're doing. Do you have it? Tony, where is yours? I don't see it. You see, come on. And please go to your browser. We are going to go through 6 questions of the greatest importance that have been cooked by Comrec on behalf of BEREC. And in order to give you vital input to this question, I'm asking you to enter in your favorite browser www.menti.com. When Tony is ready, I know the rest of you will be ready, so Tony will tell me when you're there. And then you enter, when you're there, you enter the code 640543. Okay? Who is there? Who sees on his screen the 6 question? Just give me a feel. Yeah. Okay, Yves, I knew Yves would be there, but Tony's still not. Okay, great. Okay, let's go. So, great question. We first want to know who's in the room. So, which stakeholder group do you belong to? Okay, and then you've got 5 options. So, you select the one, and then you submit. And we will see on the screen, okay, so you see there that we have a majority of policymakers. So you see industry regulators are here to listen to you. Few consumers. That's great. Okay, great. Let's now move to the next question, and for that, the presenter, that's me, needs to press on this button. Is that correct, Joe? Voilà. So next question, which is now on your screen as well, is what is your feel on the balance of the work program 2019 that Jeremy has just been presenting, you know? Do you think the balance is broadly correct? Do you think we should do more consumer protection? And I see Ursula nodding. She thinks it's a good idea. Should we be more long-term, more in the mood of the 5 topics, forward-looking topics that Jeremy highlighted, or should we stick more rigidly to the long list submitted in the code?
Well, the question about doing less.
Voilà. Okay?
Is this made by BEREC to justify what they're doing?
John, I'll give you the floor perhaps later, but not now, okay? So, unlike John, there seem to be a lot of people believing the balance is broadly correct. And then we also have beyond that, yeah, that's right, a lot of enthusiasm for forward-looking topics, 37, so that's great. Thank you so much. Next topic, stay tuned. Which choice would most benefit from enhancing levels of harmonization? Consumer protection issues, the co-investment and symmetric regulation business, market shaping aspect of spectrum assignment, net neutrality, or roaming? Okay, okay. We need more votes there. Huh? Is that fine? Who has not voted? Who is still making? More? Well, that's a good start. Yes, spectrum. Spectrum is... are you voting twice, Daniel? You know, I see spectrum going through the roof there. Okay, it's stable now. So spectrum seems to be in the lead, followed by co-investment and symmetric regulation and net neutrality, okay? Sorry, Ursula, not much enthusiasm for consumer protection. We've had a lot of it recently, to be honest. Next topic. Which of the following would be the most meaningful measure of BEREC success 3 or 4 years down the road, okay? First option, BEREC would be seen as a trusted, independent bunch of experts. Second option, the extent to which NRA's regulatory practices would have become more harmonized, one Europe. Third option, the rollout and take-up of very high-capacity networks and 5G networks across Europe. And finally, whether BEREC would have delivered all the tasks assigned to it by the code or otherwise. So, John, now that's it. Otherwise, I call the security forces to see you through the door. So a lot of enthusiasm I see again for very high capacity networks and for more harmonization. Okay, and then followed closely by enhancing BEREC's reputation as a trusted body, a pool of expertise. Next question. Which stakeholders could have the greatest impact on achieving a vision of Europe as a leader of global digital connectivity? Very good question. Entrepreneurs and those who fund them, EU institutions, member states, end users, or regulators and BEREC? I've got a strong opinion on that one. Yeah, I think I'm with the majority on that one. I think this is clear. Sorry, regulators and EU civil servants in the room. Nobody seems to believe you make much of a difference. Which of the following, what would be interesting is to have a breakdown and see what the opinion of regulators were on this one, but let's not go into the politically non-correct votes. Okay, next thing. Which of the following would be the most effective way of optimizing your involvement, your stakeholder engagement? Having expert working group, co-chair, what is this jargon, Jeremy? Stakeholder forum, that's right. So having more involvement from the room into stakeholder forum, expand BEREC's presence in, important telecom industry events, Barcelona and others. Seek input from stakeholder earlier in the project, and I think that Jeremy alluded to this one, the idea of having a two-stage process with workshop, and a lot of people seem to buy it, Jeremy. And finally, no need for an improvement. That one is not very popular. I think there is a clear winner on this one, so you were spot on. Maybe even 3 phases would be better, Voilà. Thank you so much for your valuable contribution. I think there may be plans to release the results at some stage, I believe.